So welcome to the IU Indianapolis Center for Translating Research into Practice conversation. We have a monthly conversation with our Scholar of the Month. This month, we're delighted to be introducing and sharing with you Dr. Cristina Santamaría Graff. And so I have a couple of slides I'd like to share with you just to get us started. My name is Steve Vieweg. I'm the director of the center, and it's a pleasure to be hosting you today to get to have this conversation here. Dr. Sandra Petronio and Chancellor Emeritus Charles Bantz, who had the foresight and the wisdom to encourage our campus to acknowledge and recognize translational research. And Sandra Petronio unfortunately passed away this past spring, but her ideas live on. And one of those goals was to create these conversation spaces, a place where we could engage in ideas, discussion, etc. So we thank Sandra for that vision, and we're so grateful today to have Cristina Santamaría Graff with us today to have that conversation. It's muted until there's conversation time. Please use the chat. If you have ideas that come up during the sharing of information, put them down. We'll keep track of them, but we will at some point ask you to turn your cameras on and be part of this. We are recording this, if that makes a difference for whether or not you want to be seen and heard, so that the recording is available afterwards. And we hope that you'll get a post-event evaluation, that you'll take a moment to fill that out. This opportunity is available for continuing education. If you're interested, you can give us a note and we'll link you to Expand, where you can sign up and get credit for attending these monthly seminars. Follow us on all of our social media. Everybody wants you to know what's going on at trip.indianapolis.iu.edu to see what's going on. And my internet's unstable today, so I'm going to turn off my camera in order to keep the bandwidth going. But thank you, Wind, for making this almost impossible. Hopefully you can see here that we like to put a shout out to our Bantz community research opportunities. As a legacy to Charles Bantz, when he stepped down from chancellor, the Bantz Community Research Fund was established. And this is a project that supports a faculty member on the Indianapolis campus that needs a little support to launch their translational community engaged research. So they get a year with a nice chunk of support to make that happen. But in order to keep opportunity, or you know people who might be interested, to please let us know. We're grateful to our partners in the library, to Jerry Odell, who I believe is with us today, in the opportunity for you to access our scholars' academic work through ScholarWorks. So if you go to the TRIP website, go to our featured presenter today, Dr. Santamaría Graff, you can just click on any of her research right here. It takes you straight to the journal. Or you can go to the ScholarWorks page and see her amazing ongoing list of scholarly work that's available to you just with simple clicks. So we appreciate this participation, this support and partnership with the library. It's available to you, the academic work behind the conversation and discussion. Next month, we're going to be meeting with Dr. Bill Sullivan, our Scholar of the Month, and his topic is how my lab will stop the zombie apocalypse. So you'll probably want to be around for that. It's Friday, October 25th. Watch for more information. And if you haven't yet seen the IUI Community Engaged Research to Impact Health Equity Consortium is alive and well. Sylvia Bagatti is hosting that. You can reach out to her and to get more information, but to please be a part of that opportunity. So you came today to be part of this conversation. We're so glad to have Santamaría Graff, Cristina, with us to talk about her partnership through other kinds of things, not only on campus, but other community engaged organizations. And so we've been talking about this, and I've been super excited about this opportunity, and I'm so glad that she's here with us today. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn this over to Cristina to get us going. So welcome.
Welcome. And I'm going to have to be moving through the slides a little bit more quickly, I think, today, but I welcome all of you here. And Steve, there are a lot of people that I know that are trying to get connected to the link that you sent, and they're not able to join today, or they're trying to get in, but they
I wonder if
can't.
they have an old link too. There might be two links going around. Hmm.
Maybe. I
Okay,
don't
well, I
know.
will watch the email for that. And the poll that we thought was, here we go.
And okay, so I think what we'll do is, and I'm going to regroup, take a deep breath, and welcome you all here. The title of my presentation is really around honoring families' knowledge and knowledge making in the education of their children through family as faculty approaches. And we're going to be talking about family as faculty, but in this presentation, I'm going to focus more on like the how of what I do and the why of what I do rather than the what of what I do. So the information that you'll get on family as faculty will be brief, but I've really, I'm in a place now where I'm expanding upon the understandings and framework to embrace more broadly different groups of people within this approach. So you'll be hearing a little bit about that. I'm just going to forward this. Okay, there we go. In terms of the Zoom poll, what the Zoom poll really was more about just seeing who's out here in the audience. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to move forward. And in the end, we'll have time for question and answers and having more dialogue. So the topics today, I'm going to be going through family as faculty, but really how in the last few years, it's been more and more informed by asset pedagogies or asset-based pedagogies, cripistemologies, universal design for learning, in order to honor difference and honor folks who come to the table with multiple identities so that we could co-create learning environments that are truly, in the deepest sense of the word, inclusive, where people feel a sense of belonging and they feel that they can be heard for not only who they are, but what they bring to the table. So one of the things I'll be doing throughout this presentation is posing questions. And I'm going to ask for you to just take a moment to pause and reflect and write in the chat. But for, again, the sake of time, we're going to move kind of quickly through that. And the artwork there is by one of my children who, when we're talking about difference, this was a moment, and they've given me permission to share this art. But right after the pandemic, they were coming into a space of getting to know who they were in terms of their identities, and painted this and put this together to demonstrate their own unique difference and how they want to be perceived in the world, and calling themselves by their art name, which is their Graff. So a couple of questions I want to be thinking about as we're thinking about difference and the multiple identities that we bring that we want to be honored for is a situation that you remember in school when, as a student, or maybe as a parent or a family member, when you felt that you were welcomed and what that looked like and felt like. And conversely, if you remember a time, or do you remember a time when you did not feel welcomed, or when you were made to feel maybe less than because you were different in some way? So we're just going to take a moment to take a pause and just to think about that. And in the end of this presentation, we can come back and revisit those questions. So family as faculty, my scholarship, which Steve was talking about, that is on the ScholarWorks site that you can access. You can also access it through this QR code. Some of my scholarship pertaining directly to family as faculty, but in essence and very briefly, the what of what I do is I engage families as leaders who are co-teachers and co-researchers in my courses to prepare future educators, particularly future special education teachers. So the goal is that the very first orientation to their educational career is to be led, guided, and taught by family members, particularly family members of color who have children with disabilities, but that also extends to all family members of children with disabilities who come to the table with all of their identities and all of their ways of knowing and who have struggled in the system. So what the goal is in family as faculty is for the pre-service teachers to, when they go in and into schools, that they can take the lessons that they've learned from families and see families as contributors and leaders in school spaces that they can lean on and lean into for knowledge and for really honoring their backgrounds and what they bring into for curriculum and instruction. So in terms of the how and the how I'm thinking about family as faculty and kind of the why of it, is really like how can we begin honoring them through these approaches? And there are three essential understandings that I have generated over time that I bring to all of my work. And the first is that first and foremost, families are experts and they're experts of their children. And so they are leaders in educational spaces, and they should have the opportunity to weigh in on the decisions that are impacting their children. Um, when we're educators, when we're family members and when we're students, we all come in with multiple identities. And so examining positionality, which is the second understanding, is really about how we reflect upon our own selves and we determine who we are in relation to others. Now, I'm a bilingual, bicultural Mexicana with Italian and Irish heritages. So when I'm working with Latina immigrants from all over the world, basically, I have to be very mindful about how I approach, how I'm talking about just, whose knowledge matters and whose knowledge counts. And if I'm really privileging their voices, I have to understand that we are operating here in the United States through our curriculum, through our instruction, from a very westernized perspective. So if I want to bring them into a space of empowerment and of honoring, I need to open up the door, open up the window, open up the space in the research space or the classroom for their voices to be truly heard and to be acted upon. And I need to really look at my own implicit biases to be able to do that. And along those lines, analyzing power relations within the work that I do and within classrooms and within research spaces. If we're bringing family leaders in, we position them to drive inquiry. We position them to make decisions and choices, meaning that they are sometimes the leaders that they may not be always in leadership positions. So they become leaders, and there's a shift in power with that as we step aside in our own authority and our own learning, and we listen to others who maybe drive the questions or the ways that we're going to understand children in the classroom. So applied to us in the here and now, taking some of these understandings from research, but applying them to our everyday lives, there's some questions at the bottom that we can all take a moment to reflect on and to think about how are we engaging with others in different spaces, particularly learning spaces. So what are ways we take a moment to actively listen to other people who have very different backgrounds, language or languages and cultures than we do? What are the ways we acknowledge their knowledge, that we acknowledge their knowledge and expertise? And I think collectively, I will be so bold as to say that collectively right now, with the political landscape that we're living, we are really being called to dig in deep with some of these questions as we try to hold space for one another in a very divisive time. And so some of these self-reflective questions can definitely extend to the ways that we are engaging with other family members, engaging with other professional colleagues, engaging with students, and being really honest with ourselves about where we stand on certain topics within certain contexts. So are we also willing to admit that we carry implicit biases? And I'll include traumas. Coming out of COVID, I think all of us experienced grief or loss in ways that are unprecedented and illness in general. And how are some of these traumas, impacting how we move in the world today, right? And how are these biases maybe that we've carried, how are they, when unchecked, maybe harmful to others? If we're educators and leaders in different spaces, have we really dealt with our traumas and our biases to be able to work with others in very cohesive and uplifting ways? And then finally, what power do we hold in the positions that we own, right? And how is that power perceived by others? Are we willing to let go of or step away from that power or authority to allow others to probably to guide or to co-determine or lead the way forward, particularly when those decisions impact their lives? So these are just some questions that we can come back to at the end. Now, my work of recently has been, I've been working with a lot of mothers of color, of children with disabilities. And so I'm thinking a lot about the assets they bring to the table and integrating that into a family as faculty approach for the purpose of honoring their differences. And drawing from the book Sustained Disabled Youth by Federico Wattoller and Kathleen King-Torius, I do have a chapter in this book, but and this is an excerpt. What you see here, this schematic, is from that book. But I'm really thinking about asset pedagogies and merging them with my family's faculty approach in the classroom and in research spaces, with asset pedagogies highlighting the strengths and innovations that disabled youth of color and their families bring to the classroom, to school spaces, and to the community. Okay. And so as I'm thinking about those asset approaches, I'm thinking very much about what is their expertise. How can we position their expertise in ways that they can be heard and understood for the innovative nature that they bring with their lived experiences. And then lately, I've been reading a lot of disability scholars and disability scholars of color, their work around what's called crip epistemologies and ways that we can center disability as culture. When we think of culture, there's a lot of ways to define that. But when we think about the culture of disability, we're thinking about beliefs, lived experiences, value systems, understandings of the world, how physicality and cognitive understandings and ways of looking at the world may be impacted by impairment, or the way that society has been constructed to possibly, and in many ways, disable people who have impairment or disabilities. And so crip epistemologies is disability scholars who have written about crip epistemologies. Now that's hard to say 3 times. These are the knowledges and ways of being in the world that center the position of disability that go beyond disability categories. So if you know anything about the world of disability, under IDEA, the federal law for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, you know that there are 13 disability categories. And what crip epistemologist scholars will say that, yes, we can get resources through those different categories, in schools, but they do pathologize body-mind difference. And that pathologization is really what they're trying to counter, because they're trying to tell their stories of sovereignty, stories of independence, stories of innovation, ways that they see the world that could actually improve the world for all of us. And I want to just highlight a couple ways as we're thinking about honoring and innovating the world around us through the lens of disability culture. There is something called, through crip stories that people with disabilities tell that are empowering and that center their sovereignty. There are these concepts of crip time and crip space. So crip time orients illness and disability through frequency, incidence, and occurrence, and really looks at creating ways that we can look at time more flexibly, meaning this idea of having flexible standards for this idea of wait time, extra time, more time, event time, and other understandings of time that go beyond the confines of clock time. Like we always have to always have to be there on time. We always have to finish our lesson within 30 minutes, or we have to learn all this information in 1 hour. Like, to really take that rigidity of what has to be done in clock time and be more flexible and stretch it, and know that people arrive to spaces and to places of time with difference and different ways of experiencing it. So to be flexible with that. And really importantly, and again, post-COVID, this is so important that we allow and create space for grief time. We all grieve. And in disability culture, there might be even more loss. And so having time in the school day for us to take a moment to acknowledge that we might be grieving, and to prepare spaces for that in very mindful ways, I think is extremely important for us to really consider as innovation. And then this idea of broken time, that not all of us at all times can move through the world at the same rhythm that is expected of us through our employment and our institutions. So we sometimes just need a pause to get back and to reset so that we can establish our own rhythm. And then the empowering way to look at that is to determine, what is my own rhythm, and is it in sync, or do I even want it to be in sync with clock time? And are there ways for me to break from that clock time, for me to feel valued and honored in how I express myself? Crip spaces are those where those with disability can come together almost like affinity groups and really share in solidarity of their lived experience, so that they can, this is a quote, they can uncloset themselves and speak their vulnerabilities in ways where they are not judged as being less than, but in ways where they're seen as these are important spaces where they can share their lived experiences, honor who they are, and find, again, innovation in ways that they are seen and moving in the world. They're seeing the world and moving within it. And so the question for us then becomes, what are ways that we, as able-bodied or disabled-bodied human beings with a ton of different variants in how we show up in the world, what are ways that we can show more grace to one another, to conscientiously make more time and space for those who are not like us? Okay. I'm going to skip the Zoom poll. The Zoom poll is really more about universal design for learning and all of your what your orientation is to that, but maybe by a show of hands, or just kind of maybe put in the chat if you've heard of universal design for learning, or if you have some understanding of it. Okay. So some of the work, thank you for the engagement. For some of us, universal design, like we understand it from architecture. How do we design environments that are going to really be more accessible for everyone? So for example, in the first, on the left-hand side in the picture at the bottom, you'll see a curb cut. And curb cuts, we're in architecture, we're made to create more accessible pathways for people with wheelchairs. But in essence, because those curb cuts exist, you can have children who are riding their bikes use them. You could have mothers and fathers pushing their children in strollers using it. The mail carrier, you could luggage, people carrying luggage back and forth. So curb cuts, although constructed for those who may actually need it for mobility in everyday life, when you create those environments for accessibility, it actually benefits everybody. And I think we have to begin thinking about the ways our learning environments can bend to meet the needs of everyone. And that includes within curriculum and within instruction. So as we begin to weave in family as faculty, asset pedagogy, as epistemologies, and then we bring it to how do we do this? Well, one of the hows is through universal design for learning. And this is a framework or an educational approach that aims to make learning accessible and effective for all students, regardless of difference, abilities, learning styles. And it provides a set of principles for curriculum development that give all individuals equal opportunities to learn. It emphasizes, again, flexibility, going back to epistemologies. How do we create time and space more flexibly within physical brick or mortar learning environments or hybrid spaces or even online spaces? Like, what would that look like? And let me just go back for a sec. And then how do I make the spaces that I am kind of in control of? How am I thinking about that? How am I making it accessible for everyone? And I want to share that one thing that I do when I'm teaching my methods courses, and students, it's like the first day, and students, well, they think a lot of things of me, but one of the things they think of me sometimes is like, oh, they ask, what is she doing? And one of the things I do is, because I was a kindergarten teacher, when I enter a classroom, I get on my knees and I look at the room from the time I enter the door into I move into the classroom. And one year I even brought like knee pads so I could walk around the classroom without on my knees without hurting my knees. Um, but I was demonstrating to students that we can't create an environment for children if we don't see what they're seeing. So you have to first think about, how are we making the environment accessible for everyone? And that might even mean like the physicality of the room, right? And if students can move through it with ease. What barriers or obstacles to learning need to be considered for students to learn? And that includes the curriculum and instruction, how they're being represented. And we're going to look at that in a minute. And also, how would an accessible learning environment, what would that actually sound like? When I teach students when I was a kindergarten and first grade teacher and then a special education teacher, fluorescent lighting, that hum that the fluorescent lights made, for some of my students with autism, there was and with ADHD, there was no way that they could focus on the curriculum and the instruction at the moment, because that humming noise was such a huge distraction. So we had to find another way to mitigate something that was kind of hard to control. So I asked, and this was in the 90s, so there maybe weren't as many strict parameters around this, but I brought in my own lighting, my own lamps, and created a very warm environment through natural light through the windows and through the like little lamps I would bring in, creating an environment where that humming noise was mitigated and not heard at all. Well, like I would turn off the lights so it wouldn't be heard, so that students, at least through certain parts of the day, could then focus. And that calming environment without the fluorescent lights actually helped everybody focus and learn better. And it brought a calming effect as well. So this is what we mean about the environment bending to honor and to respect the different learning styles, not only for students, but for families who you're inviting to create a welcoming and a belonging type of environment. So with UDL, there are 3 different principles that drive the framework, and one is multiple means of engagement. And this is a principle that focuses on the why of learning, and it suggests providing different ways that we can motivate and engage students, like finding what really interests them, what sparks joy, what brings them an emotional response to the learning. And this means that, again, that we take time to create spaces where children and their families, and through family as faculty, this is what I do, but we create spaces for children and families to dialogue and to have opportunities to engage in conversations that bring about understandings of the things that are done in the home that are very conducive to the child doing well in school. And so family knowledge is really a bridging knowledge. Teachers who are open to receiving family knowledge also receive a wealth of understanding of different little techniques and strategies that families use in the home that are very conducive to not only sparking joy in their child, but also to eliciting focus time and time to really just engage in the task in front of them and to complete it with success. And so we have a lot to learn from families as educators as they brainstorm with us ways that we can bridge family knowledge into the curriculum and into the instruction occurring within school settings. And then representation is really about the what of learning and how students perceive and comprehend information in unique ways, and how they feel represented in those ways. So what text, whether it's audio, visual, and like interactive, through media, are we bringing in that really is representative of topics that are not only going to elicit that joy through engagement, but also where they can see themselves in what is being presented. So yes, some teachers tell me, well, but the standards tell me I have to teach about the American Revolution and about, George Washington and, essentially about all these white men in power. And but how I counter that, or what I say is yes. And what are the leadership skills and what are the events and what are the contexts in which they were operating in, that where you can make analogies or bring in current day examples that tie directly into some of the tensions or conflicts or the leadership styles that some of those folks exhibited. And how can you make connections so that students in your classroom have a better idea of what you're talking about and it is meaningful to them in their everyday life? So, and do they see their own family's histories, and do they see their own legacies represented in the content that you're sharing? And again, teachers will say, well, that's not in the learning standards. And I just counter and say, well, how can we make it a part of the learning engagement and the standards so that we can expand upon different unique countries' histories and languages and family stories that are actually interwoven into some of these historical events. So there are ways, if we just take a moment and we look outside of the confines of the structures that have traditionally existed, to bring in a new wealth of knowledge. And that can come from families' stories. It could come from some of their resources. It could come from a lot of the ways that they've shared with their children who they are and where they come from. And then finally, multiple means of action and expression is really about all the different ways that we can have our students, there are opportunities for our students to express themselves, that isn't just limited to maybe writing an essay or typing, a paper on a computer. How about doing a podcast? How about I've been getting into TikTok lately. And like, why not create a private TikTok video that doesn't go public, or ways to use their phone in strategic ways? I know that the phone is a huge issue. So I know that that's like opening a can of worms, but with very strict parameters, and if done in the right context, a phone is a tool. It's a heuristic that can be used very meaningfully in ways that students can engage in their learning, feel represented, but also express themselves in meaningful ways that actually have traction for their current lives. So there's a lot of different ways that we can be thinking about how students can express their knowledge and demonstrate that they know the topics that they've learned about, and sharing that with their peers. Okay. And then finally, kind of pulling this all together. And I see we have a lot of chat. I'm not reading the chats yet, but I appreciate the engagement. So I'm really excited to share that CAST, the organization that where UDL was originated, and they have a whole, you could go to the link that's up there, or just type in cast.org and find a wealth of information around universal design for learning. But just this past summer in July, they came out with UDL principles, or UDL 3.0. They've kind of upgraded it so that UDL is more centered on very culturally responsive and culturally sustaining pedagogies, like asset pedagogies that really center difference and take into consideration that there are different students from different walks of life and their families and their communities who come in with different epistemologies or different ways of knowing and seeing the world. They come in with different languages, different histories, different stories, different legacies, they've come from different countries. So they have a lot to share, but how do we create pathways for them to enrich our curriculum instruction as it is today? So one way, and this pulls in these 3.0 standards, which I did not come up with these. All the bulleted points are actually language from the new 3.0 standards, but they weave in everything that I'm trying to demonstrate today through family as faculty and ways to honor our students and their families and their knowledge and knowledge making. We can, through engagement now, we can think about how do we center and affirm and sustain their interests and identities so that they feel that they belong and they're welcomed in the classroom settings. And that has to do also with promoting joy and play for learners and importantly for educators alike. I tell my students all the time, if you don't love what you're teaching and if you're not passionate about it, your students aren't going to be passionate about it. So even if you're teaching something that you find really boring, find a way, find a way to make it exciting and meaningful to you, because that joy will come across in your teaching. And then, so importantly, cultivating empathy. More than ever, we need a society that is empathetic. And when we're thinking through the lens of epistemologies, we're thinking about broken time, we're thinking about grief time, and we're finding spaces and creating spaces, maybe taking a pause in our lesson giving, right? Where we take a moment to just breathe and to cultivate that empathy for students who may be having a moment in their day that is a challenge. How do we do that? What does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like? And then when we're thinking about representation, how are we authentically representing a diversity of identities? And this is where we have to get back to our implicit biases with positionality. I talked about examining positionality. Are you willing, as an educator, to open a space for different ways of knowing that are not like your own experience? And do you have the language and the interactional ability to facilitate conversations, to allow students and even their families and communities to express different ways that they see the world and make meaning of the world? I think we have a long way to go in that area, but that's how we can begin to value people's different backgrounds truly and in the deepest ways. And then finally, with action and expression, how are we honoring and valuing a wide variety of so many different forms of communication, and how do we value those? Especially forms of communication, maybe through music or song or poetry or dance or performance or spoken word, that have historically been silenced or ignored because they haven't been understood. And then and this is the biggest one, I think, how are we challenging exclusionary practices to build more accessible, inclusive spaces and systems? And so you can have what's called an inclusive classroom, but have a kid sitting in the back of the room who is not engaging with anybody because they feel alone and they feel isolated. So to me, that's not true inclusion, even if it's an inclusive classroom. So what are ways that we can challenge those exclusionary practices so that we can build very truly inclusive spaces where children feel loved, they feel like they belong, and extending that to families? How can we create classrooms and schools as communities where families feel loved and they feel that they belong? And this is, I think, our charge in 2024 as we move into 2025 in the next few months. And I'll leave us with these questions at the end, and then we can engage in dialogue. And again, I appreciate all of you being here, and even with a little bit of the snafus from the very beginning, just trying to get the Zoom right. But what are innovative ways that you can imagine family, school, community partnerships as being central to how decisions are made in school? This is really important. Like, this is a shift remember I talked about analyzing power relations. If you bring in family and community and they're helping to make school, decisions with and alongside schools, what does that really look like? And that would mean different structures and infrastructures to facilitate that kind of dialogue and decision making. And in the future, if families are the center of education and are honored for their assets and lived experiences, what would schooling look like, sound like, and feel like? And I just want to highlight with this before I stop that I think it's also important when I talk about families. I'm moving towards a social justice understanding of centering families centering the voices of those who have been typically erased versus centering families who have a very strong agenda where they feel that their way is the best way and that their way should be the way that everybody has to learn by. And so there is a little bit of a that's kind of the landscape of what's happening in family engagement within our country that I just want to make everyone aware of, so that as we're going into this next part of the dialogue and conversation, we can be mindful of those tensions that do exist. So I appreciate all of you. I'm going to stop my share so I can see everybody, and thank you. And I'm looking forward to questions and having conversation.
Well, thank you, Christina, for sharing all that information. And we invite you to turn on your camera if you can, and uh, or ask a question. And while you're thinking about doing that, I was not able to say earlier in the introduction of Dr. Santamaría Graff was that she was the 2018 Vance Community Scholar. So this work has been supported for quite some time, and it's really fun to hear where this is now as you talk about this work and the direction that it's taken. So you'll notice in the chat that most people were not familiar with UDLs. This is at least that responded. So this was a new idea for people. So that might be an interesting conversation, is to ask more about that. Go ahead, please.
Emilio!
Hey, Cristina, so good to see you. So I have a question I'm really curious about, as you have mentioned the role of these families in essentially schooling pre-service teachers, right? What kind of patterns have you been able to identify in terms of things that they're sharing in their experiences, in terms of that might fall into generic categories, I guess? For example, is there patterns that you have heard emerge about not being seen? Are there patterns that are emerging about linguistic access? Or the patterns that are emerging about not contextualizing things? Again, I'm just kind of drawing things, making some assumptions, but I'm really curious to see if you've noticed anything, like these ideas, these things keep coming back in terms of things that need to be addressed, right? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I can talk about the patterns from 2 points of view. One, through family as faculty, the parent point of view,
Mm-hmm.
and then the pre-service teacher's point of view. And with the family's point of view, again, I intentionally recruit mostly families of color, of children with disabilities, or disabled youth, if you want to use identity first language. And what's coming out of the literature, and or out of my scholarship, and particularly with mothers, because I work with a lot of mothers, although I do work with fathers, Latine fathers as well, is that many times it comes down to the logistics of receiving services for their child in schools, and that what they really want pre-service teachers to know is that there is the interpersonal relationships that they have, when they come to the classroom and they talk with teachers. And, those interpersonal relationships can be very uplifting and very honoring, or they can be somewhat, they can be positioned as feeling less than, or that they're not being heard. But let's say it's a teacher that is honoring them and is affirming who they are in these informal settings, maybe coming to a parent-teacher conference, or maybe just, communication after school or whatever. Well, those spaces of informal dialogue can be very different in an IEP meeting, an individualized educational meeting that is very formalized, that is driven by federal law, that trickles down through state law and through local educational agencies, the school district, and determining services for the student based on a number of factors that are dialogued with through the case conference committee. And parents many times feel that even if they have a good relationship with the teacher in a classroom space, when they come into a more formalized space, which is, really talking about, in many ways, we talk about restrictive environments in the classroom. Well, the IEP is its own restrictive environment for families where they feel many times unheard and marginalized, completely erased, particularly if English is not their first language. So they feel that that space is weaponized many times. And that is a pattern that comes up again and again. How can we still, this whole idea of compliance and having to stick true to compliance, but here's my question, does compliance have to be dehumanizing?
Yeah.
And that pattern comes up again and again and again. So with the pre-service teachers, what we're really trying to do is build this notion, build within, it's an internal reflexivity process of really listening to families and internalizing their stories so that they can develop critical consciousness to awaken to the fact that families are hurting through the actions that we perform in schools. And how can they, as true, they want to be advocates of children. They say they want, a lot of, I, as an educator, I even say that I want to be an advocate of families. I want to be an advocate of students. But are my actions and my words and my language and the context in which I am working with families, am I actually reproducing harm unconsciously or even consciously? Or am I being quiet because I want to comply and I don't want to be seen within a system of compliance that I am rocking the boat or that I am, somehow stepping on people's heels or whatever. But at what cost? So then my other question is, at what cost? So we have to build leaders, educational leaders who are willing to navigate these compliance spaces within schools and find ways to make these spaces humanizing and honoring to the families that they are stewards of as they're part of the fabric of their classroom.
That's a great specific. Thank you. And I almost wonder too, of course, if you flip the other side, that there are probably educators in that same space that feel equally dehumanized from going through that process. So that's great. Well, not great, but I mean, I love the specificity of what you mentioned there in terms of that pattern. Thank you so much.
Thank you. But that is a good point, and about the teachers. Teachers are feeling dehumanized by the systems that they're currently in. And when we apply a family as faculty with those essential understandings and some of those questions that I was asking to teachers, again, it goes beyond, I think this work goes beyond just trying to implement an approach or a structure. It is more about how do we find infrastructures of support within us and externally that are going to reflect our values. So if we say that we're educators who are that believe strongly in the honoring of families, how are we creating structures for our own selves? How are we taking care of ourselves and creating spaces that honor us? Because if we don't feel honored, then we cannot extend honoring to other people.
And Christy,
you just froze, my friend.
I was saying I'll turn off again, but as we near the end of our time, we know people have to connect to their next appointments at the top of the hour. A takeaway I heard you say that in the universal design aspect in this work, that what's beneficial for those folks actually is beneficial for everybody. And I think that's an important takeaway, that this is worth thinking about, because it not only helps the individuals that we're all about hoping to help, whether it's the kids or the teachers, but it's good for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we need to begin looking at the work of all of us, like all the work that we all bring to the table in ways, and making connections between how we are making conscious efforts in honoring each other, and really bringing that to the forefront as like strategies that can be used in meaningful ways, not only in classrooms, but in society as a whole. Like, I think we need to remember that we're human beings and that we are all in struggle to some which way, shape, or form. And some of us probably, some of us more than others because of the systems that exist. And to remember that we all bring assets to the table and to find ways to honor those assets, especially when those assets are building towards creating bridges between communities that that really desire to be heard. And how can those of us who are heard create more space and more honoring spaces to uplift and bring along those um, who have been in struggle, and without without seeing them as less than, because that's the other thing. We also have to acknowledge that those of us who are in that have power, and we can sometimes go into spaces thinking that we need to do things, and that's not always the case. We can just be quiet and be active observers and active listeners, and to experience great cultural humility in our learning, so that a true meaningful, you know, kind of a co-learning can occur between communities, rather than and finding those universal understandings. I know that's a little esoteric, but I'm always thinking kind of that way.
Well, that seems like a good place for us to pause and officially thank you for being our Scholar of the Month and sharing this conversation with us today. And as is our standard, some of us will hang around for a while. If you have time and want to still converse or share something after the official meeting, please stay. But otherwise, we appreciate you coming. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.
Thank you.